The following is a production of UNO Television for KYNE TV. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome to UNO. We are in the Student Center, a little busy here as always, so if you hear some noise, it's just students doing their student thing. Today I ask you to consider this: one issue can win an election. We'll consider that with Bernie Kolasa, Dr. Bernie Kolasa, Political Science Department at UNO, and actually a professor of mine many moons ago. And also with us today is Sister Mary Macaulay Gilgannon. She is a scholar in residence at the College of St. Mary, a history professor, a PhD, and has taught a political science class or two and is very interested in at least observing politics. I don't think you've run for anything as Dr. Kolasa has.
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. I'm fascinated by what's going on in the elections, and what struck me was, and I told you before the show, that I get many of the faxes and I read them all from the candidates, and they stack right now so far for two offices, the gubernatorial in Nebraska and the 2nd District Congressional, that tall, and that's minus the cover pages. So there's a war of words going on all the time. They're trying to generate coverage. But what struck me was that the Metro Right to Life endorsements came down, which they do every time, and I'm flipping through them and I'm going, my goodness, they endorsed a candidate for county engineer, people in charge of our roads. And then I look at the Right to Life issue, which is mentioned prominently in people's stance for these positions, and also this whole conservative religious right thing that's kind of going on, or how right can you be? Bernie, both of you, but Bernie first, what's your take on this? Is this different than the elections we've had, or we have this new anti-homosexual kind of...
Well, I don't think that, obviously the Metro Right to Life's been around for a number of years.
And I just use them as an example.
Yeah, the increase of attention by religious groups to politics and elections, I think, probably was triggered most significantly in the recent history by the involvement of Pat Robertson running for president in 1988, and I think that started the Christian Coalition and other movements. However, of course, religious groups have been involved on the American political scene almost right from the very beginning. Again, the Prohibition period with the Women's Christian Temperance Union were certainly very strong religious organizations. There was a very significant involvement of religious groups and clergy in the 1960 presidential election when a Catholic was running for president.
That's right.
So actually, the interaction of politics and religion is not new in the American context, but it has, I think, at various historical periods, some different nuances. And I think that the more recent pattern of involvement, I think, dates from about 1988 and the emergence of organized religious groups with some very specific purposes in supporting and running candidates reflective of their ideology for offices up and down the line.
Sister, what's your observation of this? Are we seeing something more so than before, or just...
Yes and no, perhaps. One thing, we have communications facilities now which make any opinion, any stance much more available to more people much more rapidly than ever happened before in history. But if we go back to the colonial origins and move forward, we will find that all the way, the initial people who came in, the British colonies, the English colonies, were not all Anglicans, but they branched off into Congregationalists and so on.
Certainly the Puritans.
They were English. And then as after the Revolution, more immigration took place. And in the 19th century, as Europeans, Northern Europe, Irish particularly, Southern Europeans, Italians, and then the Germans came after the revolutions of 1848, and it picked up. What began to happen was that the initial Americans looked upon these people as foreign, even within the Catholic community. Catholic immigrants were sometimes looked down upon by the, quote, established people who had been here. So it isn't all that new. Human nature is the most exciting thing and the most perplexing thing on earth to study. And it's been around forever.
I think that's an understatement. But even when I look back to the 60s, which I can remember, I can't remember the Congregationalists that came over. In the Kennedy thing, it was more just the Catholics were pulling for Kennedy, and then, you know, there were many Protestants that didn't want Kennedy, but it wasn't so much ideological, other than the Pope would take over the United States. It wasn't so much ideological as just a protection of kind of your group and your, you know, just who you were and sort of in general. I didn't get the specific kinds of feelings that I'm getting now.
Well, part of the difference is that since 1988, the biggest thrust has come from what would be identified as the Christian fundamentalist segment. Now, I think you have to be a little careful, because there's not a monolith anymore in talking about Catholicism
and their
being a
views
monolith.
are shared by
But there
many
are some common characteristics, and that is that this is the strain of Protestantism which believes in the inerrancy of the Bible, a more literal interpretation, whereas the more mainstream, what we might call mainstream Protestant sects, who had been more involved in politics before, looked for more interpretive analysis of the Bible and not a literal interpretation. So what you're getting then, I think, is a more of an ideological slant, a more theologically ideological slant as it relates to politics than we may have gotten before. So that does make it, I think, again, somewhat different in how it works its way out in relationship to issues, in relationship to what they're looking for in candidates, in supporting candidates, and so forth.
Now, no doubt, the heartland here is, I would say, I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked at the surveys, but we consider ourselves a religious group of people, primarily Christian. We don't, you know, if you go to the coast, or perhaps maybe the East Coast, where you would have a lot more Muslim impact, or Jewish impact, or well, it seems to be moving all over the world now, the different religious groups. But we do at least align ourselves, many of us, with Christianity. We do have some Jewish presence and Muslim presence in Nebraska. So I would not be surprised that the Christian, or at least the Judeo-Christian ethic, morality, would play a part in who we would elect. But, you know, we're looking at everything about everybody's life down to the nubbins, down to the very little thing, and yet we don't judge our neighbors like that.
We do and we don't. When you get right down to it, we're getting very judgmental of one another, and I think we're going to have to put some brakes on it, because if we're really Christian, and if we're really out of the Hebraic tradition, and the Christians are the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we use the Bible as our main basis of faith, we have to be true to what we believe, and when we depart from that, we're being less than whom we profess to be. Because the whole doctrine of Christianity is based on love thy neighbor.
Well, I'm glad you brought that love thy neighbor thing up, which I consider a very paramount part of at least the New Testament. And I don't want to get into big theological discussion here. But our local candidates, particularly in the gubernatorial race, have glommed onto this friction in the United Methodist Church with the gay unity ceremony, and have taken that and grabbed onto it and put the whole gay issue into whether, if you're for a candidate, you're anti-gay, and if you're not, you must be pro-gay in every way, shape, or form. I'm oversimplifying. But how did this gay thing get so
I
prominent?
think, again, that's an issue that is not a front burner issue as far as the public policies of the state of Nebraska and anything. I mean, you want to talk about taxes, that's a front burner issue. You want to talk about education, should the state pick up the difference in money which is being lost because of the lid on property tax. These are, of course, legitimate public policy issues. But they are not the kinds of issues that can appeal to emotions. And one of the things we find at campaigns, with the advent, I think, of the mass media and television, where you're limited to 10 or 30 seconds to get your message across.
And how many people you can meet? physically.
That's correct too. So you have to utilize, and the political consultants have come to understand that if you can grab a hold of an emotional issue to make some sort of a linkage or contact with the voter, that's what you go for. And I think this is just another example of because I noticed that when it first came up, it was simply an addition, another 10 seconds on an old commercial that had no connection whatsoever. It's like, let's add this little...
The Breslow ad, yeah.
Well, I didn't want to identify.
Well,
but anyway, yes, it
was
was a Breslow. And it just added on. It wasn't even an integral part of the campaign. So it was an attempt to try to gain some support for an issue that had flared up because of what was happening within the Methodist Church there and was making headlines.
Well, my introduction to any memory of politics came in the memorable campaign of 1928. And as an Irish Catholic Democrat,
a very young
28, by the way.
Yes.
No, in 1928.
I was very aware. I was very aware of the adults, in our family and in the community speaking of issues. With regard to President Hoover and his opponent in the campaign, Alfred E. Smith.
Well, what were the issues then?
Well, one of the main issues remember we were in the roaring 20s.
Don't say remember to me.
Pardon me, my students have said that to me many times. One of the major things, we were in the era of prohibition at that time, and that was very controversial. Organized crime was benefiting tremendously. It would benefit more within the next few years as the Depression came on. But the thing that Al Smith used to say, and radio was big. I think radio is great because that introduced me to the wide world. And Al Smith would say, let the record speak for itself. And he would be vilified from time to time because if he were elected, Rome, just the same, similar things to what Kennedy, that we would have a foreign power as our major leader, And of course, anybody that's an Irish Catholic knows that when Parnell was being taken to the cleaners in Ireland for a number of things, and there was a campaign to raise money for him in 1883, a papal rescript went to the Catholics not to support it, and the Catholic response was, we will take our politics from Rome, we will take our religion from Rome, but not our politics.
Well, that brings me to the issue of the separation, not of church and state so much, but to a degree that, in my way of thinking, that people want taxes to be brought under control. They want the best bang for the buck on what they are taxed on and is spent. And yet this religious thing seems to be fairly dominant. You mentioned, as a member of the school board, as someone that's running, that you get the pro-life. Again, I'm not picking on them, but the questionnaire that even asks basically your associations with other candidates, whether you've ever given money to a candidate that might have or was pro-choice. How far is this going to go, or is this just cyclical?
Well, I think historically the line between the religious and the religious and the secular has been fuzzied. I mean, you may talk about the wall of separation, which of course was never reality, never has been. But there have been some lines that have been drawn at different times in history of kind of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And so I think what we have to really look at in the current context is what are some of the activities and what are appropriate and what are not. Certainly anybody with an interest in an open society has the ability to organize, and nobody would deny anybody, whether it's economic, social, religious, or whatever, to be able to organize, to present candidates, to present what their message is, to say this is what I think needs to be done and this is how I'm going to do it. In fact, we probably need more than less of that in order to be informed voters and to make our choices. But there are still some lines which are being drawn. And I might point, I was in San Antonio for a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and there was an op-ed piece in the San Antonio paper written by the senior pastor at the Baptist Church. So again, this is one of the more conservative religious sects. And he was commenting on the Christian Coalition's their basic voter guide that they put out in elections now. And he indicated that in this voter guide, the Christian Coalition had taken stands and positions on taxes, on the teaching of phonics in schools, with the assumption that you weren't a good Christian candidate unless you were for teaching of phonics and so forth. And he took exception to this. He said that the voters' guides have more to do with partisan politics and very little to do with being Christian. And he felt that his integrity as a cleric was being compromised in being asked to pass out information under the guise that this somehow was the Christian position on taxes. He basically said at the end of his little op-ed piece, he says, good Christian people can faithfully disagree on many political issues, and there are many things Jesus didn't talk about or even consider. Phonics obviously certainly would have been one of them. And said that perhaps...
At least nobody wrote it down.
Nobody wrote it down, and I doubt very much that. And he said that Christians would be better served if they focused on the things that Jesus did talk about. So I believe even some leadership within what we might identify as the Christian fundamentalist religious community are, again, there is a diversity there, and that people who are asking some questions, are we stepping over the line here in some of these things that we are doing under the guise of religion and the role of religion. But again, politics and religion has always been an overlap in our history, and that,
Well, certainly religious freedom has been involved in an issue in politics.
But when you think about it, in the Western tradition, this is not true of the rest of the world civilizations, but the Aristotelian concept, one of Aristotle's greatest legacies to contemporaries, is his politics, and he spoke of man as a political animal. Religious people have said, I can't remember now who said the quotation, but man, humankind, is incurably religious. And you can see this. You can see this all through. If there isn't any organized creedal stance, there is some desire to honor, to acknowledge the existence of some higher power. So when zeal, I think, is marvelous. I've always admired zealous people. I can disagree with them, to
Zealously.
the nth degree, zealously. But when a person with zeal becomes a zealot, the rest of the society is in trouble. Truly. And Voltaire was on the index for all of the things that have been said against him. As a sophomore in high school, I admired him tremendously, not because he said of the church, crush the infamous thing. I thought that was stupid. But he did say, though I disagree violently with what you have to say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. And when you think of what a right isn't something anyone can give any of us. I can't give you one, you can't give me mine. Those are innate, they're God-given from my stance. Nobody can take those away from us. And so when people exercise their right of speech, of assembly, of organization, if we don't like it, we do not have to choose it. We have an obligation. We went through a thing in this country that has bothered me for many years called value-free education. And now we're worried about all the things that aren't right in our society. We have to have values, and it is the individual conscience, aided by the community and communities of which we are a part, that help each of us to formulate that conscience. Even a doubtful conscience is to be obeyed in theological teaching and ethical teaching. No one in the human community is really free to violate his or her own conscience. And I don't think we worked on this. So if somebody is disagreeing with me politically, that person has as much right to his or her position as I have to mine. When I go to those polls, I don't go because some organization told me what to do or what not to do. I have to get myself informed. In this city, for many years, it was the League of Women Voters, God bless them, who enabled us to know. Then, once upon a time, not too long ago, the World Herald decided it had a few obligations to inform us about the little bio data on our candidates. But I have to make that choice. I can't blame somebody
that's
else.
true too, which leads me, and having spent many years in television, to the fact that we're busy human beings. We're crazy with busyness. Some of that necessary, some of it not. Much of it necessary, some of it not. And we are very affected by advertising campaigns and political sound bites. And my concern isn't, and I brought up this whole religious thing not because that bothers me so much, is that we have racism we've been worrying about for a while. Now are we going to, with more of a melting pot, more Asians here, more other nationalities, are we going to have a religious-ism? I don't know what the right word would be. On our way. I mean, are we seeing the beginnings of that? You say it was always here, so maybe I shouldn't worry about it.
Well, I think that these are concerns that people ought to gain information, become knowledgeable about, and so forth. And again, I say I don't have any problem with people organizing. I don't have a problem with people stating what their positions are, because that gives me, as hopefully a somewhat informed voter, the ability to make choices, and that's my job, is to make choices. And if that information isn't out there, I should try to find it. Now, the trouble is that we have become perhaps a little lazy in our political responsibilities to gather that information and to make those decisions as a society. As you say, we have so many other things. Well, we have to prioritize. Maybe we're not prioritizing the gathering of political information as great as we should. Maybe we're not doing a great job on civic education in our schools. Maybe our educational system needs to make some adjustments so that people will be somewhat more informed. And as long as the pool of information is out there, I think that's the greatest protection from any particular overriding philosophy or ideology from, again, creating a negative environment for say, the rest of us.
Well, certainly technology, I talked about television, but I do say that when I want to look up something on a candidate, I go to the internet and I find the good, the bad, and the ugly, depending on whose point of view is. There is information out there if you're willing to sift through it, and there is information around this community too.
But there's a problem there too, because a lot of that information is unevaluated. You can get a lot of disinformation on the internet because it's a new mechanism. So we need to accustom ourselves to being good users of this information as well.
Just as we used to select our newspapers and our magazines, and there's a plethora of those out. There are more magazines and newsletters, and even without the internet, the majority of them have, if not an editorial bent, certainly an entire philosophical bent. I mean, and you can quote from anything anymore.
Absolutely, but as Dr. Colossus said, there is so much misinformation, and one of the things that a lot of generators of information, misinformation and disinformation included, do not really take into consideration is you don't have a right to falsify anything about another person, and you certainly have no right to present as fact what you do not know to be fact. And what are we out judging other individuals about anyhow? If we'd all clean up our own doorsteps, we wouldn't have to worry nearly as much about the politics of this city or any other place.
I've said that about Bernie for a long time. What kind of a citizen am I?
If
Bernie would just clean up his own doorstep, and he said the same about me. But no, I think you go back to your judgment that people are too judgmental.
And you know, again, with the whole right to life issue, the pro-life and the pro-choice. Well, I have many friends who, identify as pro-choice. I say God is pro-choice. He gave us a free will, and He said, "You make your choice." But then I say sometimes I get radical, and I say, "No, I don't run them over, but so and so, she should not have endured that pregnancy. She should not have had that child." You know, when the woman in South Omaha died after her little youngster was 18 months old. That woman made her choice. She had every right to make it, and she chose life for that child. And I think that child someday will do some good for lots of people.
You know, you mentioned, or I mentioned, we're all busy. We're not taking the time to research our candidates. A new radio campaign started this week for Brad Kuiper. And he has a man and woman talking, and it says, basically, well, I'm really glad that I'm voting for Brad Kuiper because, he really came out strong against that judge that said it would be all right to have a homosexual scoutmaster. And the man in it, presumably the husband character, said, well, can you tell me more about it? So she says, no, I've got to go. It sort of epitomized, this sort of selectivity that we all have, I think, to some
A judge
degree
who,
or
of course, is not from Nebraska, nor was
No.
an issue in a Nebraska
No, it
court,
wasn't in
and wouldn't be
Nebraska.
covered by much to do with being governor of Nebraska. But again, the point is, here's the attempt to try to latch on to a somewhat emotional issue and the reaction from the public to an emotional issue.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and I just want your take on some of the good, let's say the good campaigns that are running, or the things that you, even in the ones where you have mixed emotions, the things that you think are positive about maybe the campaigns that are out there. Big pause. No.
I guess I would say I don't see that so far what we've seen is any worse or even perhaps any better than what we've seen over the last couple of decades. One of the phenomena that's occurred is, of course, that we have shifted from party organization-based campaigns to candidate-oriented campaigns. So individuals build their own base. And with the advent of the electronic media, a great deal more emphasis on political consultants, pollsters, and so forth. So I think we're getting continue to get some degree of disinformation in the sense of what the real candidate is and what the candidate really thinks on the basis of the way the game's played, if you will. But I haven't seen anything that at least to this point. Now we got a couple more weeks to go yet, so if there's going to be some negative campaigning, it's probably going to happen within the last week or 10 days, as it usually does.
Sister, I want to say sister doctor, sister.
Oh, sister, that's what I've been to more people for most of my life.
What are your
That's great.
observations?
What I notice is that within the party structure itself, and this rather, builds on what Dr. Colossus said, some of the candidates forget even what the party stands for and go ripping at each other as the competition gets tough. And when the interviews are held on Channel 3 on Sunday mornings, what time around? It's
Right. Joe
10
Jordan's
o'clock.
show. Mhm.
Joe's is at 10. Sometimes you wonder at the, I don't know whether it's fair to call it immaturity, but it's a kind of childishness when they will occasionally, two rivals will be there, and they will go like third grade boys, and I taught from the elementary grades on up.
Well, I have to end the show here, but I would say, given your longevity, you probably would recognize immaturity if you saw it. I want to thank you both for being here today, Dr. Bernie Kalasa, Political Science UNO, and Sister Mary Macaulay Gilgannon, a scholar in residence at the College of St. Mary. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Carol.